Welcome back to another episode of Liberty and Morality Defined presents 9/11 and my search for the Isle de Monte Cristo. There are undoubtedly 1,000 articles, tenfold that number in posts, and infinite comments shared about September 11th, discussing those historical events for the United States that day in 2001. Some will theorize about how the federal government did this and that to incite the attacks or even plotted the attacks entirely. Whatever the case may be, many of those on part of my generation, Generation X, the generation trailing the baby boomers, now associate that particular event the same way the previous does with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So, where were you when the trade towers were struck? I remember where I was when the events were unfolding. I also remember listening to the news reports for the next several weeks. During the late 90s and early 2000s, I remember, well, what was important to me. What was important to me then were all the things I later considered wastes of my time. Today, I don't really think that anymore, not at all. I still have little issues about that because of the way society sees certain things. But in fact, the things that I did before I began trying to comprehend the world around me eventually helped me on my path to understanding. Throughout the years, I have posted and blogged about the importance of critical thinking. Oftentimes, I've dismissed any ability on my part to think critically before acquiring the family I made during the mid 2000s until the mid 2010s. Today, with the new family I'm building, I have 20 years of adulthood under my or in my proverbial experience cache. However, the most important aspect is not the family experience, rather the internal confidence to problem solve and not rely upon others without first having a clear idea of what I can do for myself prior to interacting with them. At least that's how I see it. I used to dismiss a lot of my own ability to think critically because the path I walked seemed so radically different than what is often taken for normal or was expressed to me as being normal. I'd always been capable of critical thinking before I started one family and was forced to let go and began a new one. The trouble was that I just didn't understand it because of my social environment. I didn't realize what I was capable of because the interests I had were not normal for much of the social aspect that I was a part of. I enjoy playing video games and computer games which required a fair amount of thought beyond simple Pac-Man and the like. While I did play chess, my focus was on role-playing games such as Final Fantasy. In my earliest adult years, between working in various bar and grill establishments as a cook, a trainer, and low-end management while trying to attend college, I played hundreds of hours of Civilization, SimCity, StarCraft, and a plethora of different Star Wars games filled with riddles and puzzles to unravel. I was told often by family, particularly my father, that these things would never help me. I was told that I was wasting my time, that I should learn to value working and get a good state job for security with him. I played these games because I enjoyed the comfort of figuring out challenges that didn't scream in my face like he did. I enjoyed them because I could control their outcomes in a way I wasn't able to fathom about my own life at the time. They were my escape from my past reality. They may not have been a real challenge to some. To me, though, they were how I figured out how to problem solve a lot of things in my life at the time. If at the very least, simply not just deal with it. I learned a lot about cause and effect since so many of the games were complex trigger based. I know that'll sound pretty lame to some big name intellectuals and the internet bullies, but that was my path. The creators of the games I played did a spectacular job in designing their products. In order to get beyond beating mere challenges by figuring out strategies, I had to look up information about virtual enemies I was competing against in actual library books. I could have easily played these games as they were, but I realized they were often based on real-life events or strategies employed in real life. That allowed me, by looking the information up, to actually excel in these games and control them better before I ever figured out what the cheat codes were. These games set me on a path to researching real historical events. The Civilization series had me falling in love with history. At first I enjoyed only ancient history, but As the series progressed, I began to love modern U.S. history and the development of the Americas. In fact, it was the shiny little tidbits of information about personalities in American history which presented themselves to me as each game progressed in Civilization 3 that just sparked my new love. I spent time researching civil functions also because of SimCity. I learned more about how local government worked by researching the various advisors in the game through real encyclopedias than, than I ever did sitting in a classroom. Now, this was before the internet was as available as it is to us today to a quick and easy assignment project. I learned things I never would have learned listening to some teacher barking at class clowns and answering the questions of those students whose minds were more easily fit to the mold of the Prussian model school system. And through the more than 1,000 games of StarCraft I played, I began taking an interest in reading what other science fiction authors had to say about the infinite what-ifs of the universe. I hated reading as a child because I couldn't stay focused. I was afraid a lot. I was intimidated a lot. I didn't care for the fact that if I got this wrong or I didn't understand what I read, I was somehow stupid. It was constantly thrust in my face as something of vital importance, but reading, it was never explained to me by the individuals presenting the matter with a clear path of thought progression exactly why reading is important. I could lay that out entirely in a single meme, a paragraph, or even a huge essay today, but I'll save that for another time. I could be exponentially smarter today if I learned how to focus while reading sooner. Oh, but all of the would've, should've, and could've's. While I want to blame those responsible for my upbringing and the society which produced them, I cannot honestly do so today, knowing they were and remain nescient. Uh, no matter about that, because all of the boring authors forced on me in school once filled my bookshelves years later. I began questioning my own religion because of the backstories associated with that StarCraft game, the real-time strategy game that is. I won't go into detail, but I'll share that the stories I read brought back hundreds of memories of speaking with my grandmother about life on other planets as a kid. The things that I forgot as I was transferring into my teenage years and becoming more and more on hostile terms with my father. The fondest memories I have of my grandmother are the stories she told me about how she and her father would have peaceful moments together in the midst of all the chaos Hitler was causing in Germany as she passed through her teenage years. These moments were spent stargazing with her father as he told her how mankind might have come to Earth after they destroyed Mars by building too many polluting factories. The conversations we had about how and why the Earth is so big and small in such a vast space are just as amazing to me today as they were then. I understood the basic premises of such technologies, the potential of mankind to make things happen, and I'm excited I took the journey I did, thinking the way I did, because of these things that were so ridiculed by my father and so much of society. Stop playing games, go to college. I only wish my father hadn't been as rough, tunnel vision focused, and angry, leading him to accept that it was okay to scream at a little boy who was terrified of him so often. But as I grew, came to big fights with him and the scare of my life when I entered into the world with nothing except a bit of poor information. Authority is good. I knew the whole time that things I enjoyed would be useful, or at least I hoped they would. It was just a feeling deep down inside because I couldn't believe they didn't have a purpose. How could I be so good at them and somehow be worthless in everything else in my life? I just had to find a way to relate them to the world around me. That was terribly difficult, with so many people yelling at me, putting pressure on me to conform to what they thought was normal and would be good for me. None of these people understood how to truly communicate an idea because they couldn't even explain to me with the utmost clarity what they felt in sentiment. So I clung to my video games and science fiction like a bastard child to his only teddy bear friend, even as a 24-year-old man. And to throw gasoline on an oil fire, I became especially scared when the various news organizations in late 2001 were hinting, cheering, and berating the possibility of a draft. That was my wake-up call to start paying attention to things outside my insignificant bubble of influence. I knew that there was nothing my parents could do to stop the federal government from collecting me for use as nothing more than a bullet catcher and an order follower if a draft was initiated. I don't ever recall being that afraid of government before or since. It was my absolutely it was my wake up call from a dream world to the real world in a matter of just a few weeks. Now, I think maybe that is a little unfair in terms of wording it. It wasn't really a dreaming, and I wasn't really dreaming and off in another world. I was simply neshing. I didn't know any better. It was a shock factor more than anything else, I suppose. What I did know was that authority wasn't quite correct, or it was off, or something other than trustworthy. At the time, I couldn't distinguish between legitimate authority earned, such as that of a teacher or artisan crafter who learns or profession or skills for years to understand it, and the authority or legality and might makes right, and that which comes with the pointing of the gun and the raging of a truncheon at anybody. What I did know was that I could have everything taken away from me that I worked for. At the time, it wasn't much, but I went out and I worked for what little I did have. So to know that I could just suddenly be collected and handcuffed and have men with machine guns point them at me, that hit me hard. Too many people do not understand deeply enough the purpose and value of creation. I'm probably some weak and pathetic fool to them. Yet, to recognize this about myself, admit it, and be willing to share it with others to help enlighten takes a kind of strength that those who ridicule me for being weak likely do not have if they understand it at all. That kind of a strength. And in understanding this, I immediately realized the entire sentiment about draft dodgers in the Vietnam War. I was listening to the conservative, the stereotypical Republican mumbo jumbo about how people were draft dodging and that they were not patriotic to their country. I felt that understanding and sentiment all those years ago, but I could not quite explain it to you. I had acquired the first of many epiphanies on my journey to understanding liberty. The few skills and knowledge I picked up from my games helped me along. It didn't give me a lot at first, but it did grant me the idea that clarity of context is absolutely necessary in problem solving. I also had learned during my time as a cook that communication is key to success in such environments, though I wouldn't recognize either of those lessons until more than a decade after the terrorist attacks of September 11th. Though for the time, I searched for clues and answers to questions I didn't even know I was asking yet. All I knew was that something was wrong and that I was missing some vital information. So I started listening to talking heads on television and reading their books. I was more actively discussing politics and even made temporary patches in my relationship with my father by doing so. Finally, I was taking an interest in the real world that he so desired I do instead of wasting my time on things he didn't understand how I experienced and why. I remember thinking something was grossly wrong with the news media in time and his politics. I kept listening to him and talking heads over the years. I was introduced to books by people whom I thought were kooky. Many of these books were authors I'd never heard of before, but I understand and know well now, such as Ayn Rand and von Mises and Rothbard. Now, I didn't reject those books then because what the people promoting them were saying was wrong. I rejected reading them because the people advocating them were discussing what the current U.S. political left touts as extremist right-wing insanity far beyond Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, and Bill O'Reilly. I was raised as a conservative Roman Catholic. I was also raised to recognize that the Southern Confederacy was the victim and the Northern Federal Republic the bully, which was a bit of a contradiction in the political philosophies I was taught. We can't say that the South was the victim, but then somehow Lincoln's North is magnanimous. It doesn't make sense. Of course, thinking back about it today, those books that were offered to me to read um, were entirely a rejection on my part, made for no other reason than because those promoting such works couldn't break down the idea beyond sentiment. They encouraged me to read something they didn't fully understand well enough to explain, and that only helped confuse me further. As of today, I still haven't really read any of their works in whole except for Atlas Shrugged, and I liked it. It was a difficult read, but J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is more difficult. Most of what I read was historical accounts when I was able to finally get into reading and in a good rhythm. I read actual letters written between loved ones and political allies and opponents alike from the 1600s through the late 1900s. I studied the context of historical battles and the speeches given in legislatures around the United States and Western world. I asked questions to understand what people fought for and why. I asked those questions as to why people did anything they did. Chiefly, though, I was genuinely interested, and I pressed the questions of who, what, when, where, how, and why incessantly like a toddler. I learned more doing that than I think I probably ever did in 12 years of government school, because it stuck with me. I didn't just learn to memorize things. I was genuinely interested in it. And I did all of this while listening to how much the mainstream media didn't tow actual facts as much as the popular sentiment of them or what was emotionally charged. I started with WSB Channel 2 News and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in Atlanta, Georgia. I was a little confused as to why my parents enjoyed Channel 2 Action News instead of Fox 5 Atlanta. My grandmother listened to Fox 5 Atlanta. My grandmother, who I had those discussions with about where we may have come from, and my grandmother who grew up during Nazi Germany. Why would she listen to something different than my parents? I didn't understand that. So then eventually I just moved on to AM 750 WSB Talk Radio, like my father, and found Neil Bortz. What I picked up from him was to question everything I hear and read, even from him, and what I think I previously knew to be true. And then I got bored and began feeling inconsistencies in his statements about such things as his promotion of the fair tax. I turned to Fox News and liked what I heard there for more than what I heard on CNN and talk radio. But after a while, I didn't really care for what I heard there any more than what I heard elsewhere. It was just hostility, hostility, hostility. It's just too much combative nature. Like, people just want to argue for the sake of arguing. They don't want clarity. They just come on my side because the other side is awful. I mean, I probably listened to Fox News for about 6 years. I thought with the new talking heads they brought on that things were getting better. And then Glenn Beck. I really thought he was doing well with his message. But then he began preaching history. No, not teaching, okay? Preaching. His path to thought progression was actually beginning to get into understanding the importance of philosophical consistency. And the next thing I know, he seemed to go out of his way to maliciously, verbally attack Southerners and their heritage concerning what I began to understand as the War of Federal Aggression. Of course, that's what he and everyone else called the American Civil War. If you understand the events of that war, beyond just the secession documents, beyond just what a handful of people said in the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years before that war took place, if you understand the roots going all the way back to how the colonies were actually settled and where the people came from, then you'll understand why it's a war of federal aggression and not simply a war of northern aggression or a war against southern secession or independence. But what Beck was preaching was in direct contradiction to what I had found out to be the truth by going through various state and local archives to read documents written by the people at the time. I read through more than the secession documents written by the seceded states. I read many congressional speeches their legislatures and senators gave discussing the reasons for taking their positions. I read their federal counterpart speeches as well. And I also read so many of the personal letters saved from Northerners and Southerners alike, detailing the horrors they feared in war to come. What I read was absolutely different than what the supposed professionals Beck hosted said happened. And then he had a guest on his show who basically said that the only time in human history that history wasn't written by the victors was the American Civil War. I mean, I was so damned angry about that. It was a lie, and I stopped watching television in the following months. I only continued because I found a program by Andrew Napolitano and liked what I heard. That didn't last long either. Following that was a show by John Stossel, whom I remembered I enjoyed listening to when he was a journalist on regular broadcast news programs. By the end of the next 10 months or so, I was done with television. By the time Ron Paul in 2012 was being cheated out of the Republican nomination, I really hadn't had much TV viewing recently, and I promoted him loosely, but knew it was a waste of time, even though I wrote up articles about how it wasn't a wasted vote to check his name on the ballot. That was the time I was writing my third book. It was a redrafting and heavily revised version of my previous two books, which I pulled from circulation. I didn't like the inconsistencies I wrote in them. I didn't like the loose ends that I didn't recognize at the time of writing. And then I had another powerful epiphany. I was beginning to understand how to deconstruct liberty by finding the most common denominator. I had to learn what few others could teach. I couldn't just spend any more time searching for the perfect book to explain what I thought was needed. I had to write it myself. So I had to do a lot of deeper thinking than I was used to or understood how to do. That, I am sure, helped to cause a rift between my adopted daughter's mother and I, to a certain extent that we amicably chalk up to being simply growing apart. But by the time I was done writing that, Ron Paul had written another book with the same title I had chosen for mine, Liberty Defined. I read his book. It wasn't anything like what I wrote. It wasn't horrible. I mean, it was good, yet still fairly clouded from what I remember thinking it should be. A little deceptive in the title, but in fairness, I quite literally defined liberty in my book, where he discussed political issues a lot and why some positions were wrong. I didn't find Ron Paul to be a poster boy for what is wrong with U.S. politics at all. He was at the time certainly on the right path of thinking. I just wish he hadn't stayed perched on the same stepping stone of thought for so long. But then again, who really knows what will come of things if they were different? And that's just it. We can't teach what we don't know. So we remain stagnant and stuck sometimes in pools of thought. I just didn't like seeing the inconsistencies in my own works. A lot of this was rooted in my father's constant ridiculing of me, of not completing a task, by always finding something I missed. He didn't explain to me these things. I mean, I remember being yelled at by him for not taking the trash out right then, the very instant he said to do it, even though the trash wasn't overflowing. He just screamed at me, "Take the trash out," and then I remember getting smacked in the face, this big old hand right across my face. "Take out the trash. Why didn't you do it? Why are you not doing it now?" Then I put a bag back in it. He's like, "Why didn't you clean it out? Why didn't you rinse out the bottom?" Like, I don't know. He was just livid for some reason, and I don't understand why. All I understood was that I don't remember anything being in the bottom of the trash can. I didn't think there was any need to rinse it out. But that's just it. And this trend continued when I found the internet chat rooms and forums later on in life. And so what's the saying? The quickest way to find out alternative methods or why you're wrong is to make some sort of a definitive or absolute statement on the internet. That's dangerous sometimes if you take things to heart too often, and I know that I'm not alone in that, where I end up doing that. That kind of ridicule is hard to handle, because even if we are correct and the aggressor or individual attempting to offer constructive or deconstructive criticism is wrong, we crave vindication. And that is something we so often do not get, which leads many people to the feeling of as if the internet is full of overwhelming majority of mean and nasty monsters. And I still want that vindication from my father, but I'm never going to get it. He's never going to be wrong. So in face-to-face conversations, it's often different in terms of who we deal with on the internet versus people we don't know in real life, and we just start to talk about. Usually, we just disagree and walk away. But in virtual communication, there's a little recourse since there's very little recourse. I mean, since it is so easy just to walk away or build up one's ego by socially pointing out the flaws in others, and getting vindication from that's damn near impossible. This just ends up being nothing more than not the slowest individual running away from an angry bear. I mean, don't do or say anything and you won't get attacked. Basically, sit down, shut up, and hide. Uh, but if we do that, then all the bad stuff in the world keeps going on. It's almost depressing, and for me, at least often difficult to handle every day because of how my father ridiculed me relentlessly, being macho and the tough disciplinarian and authoritarian that he was. And these kinds of encounters only help to fuel my desire for consistency. Communication is difficult. We don't communicate strictly through words alone. We employ body language, volume of voice, tone of voice, pronunciation, and more. And then when we end up writing as if we're talking, these words we use often offend because as we read, we forget or don't realize that all the aspects we use to communicate can't be attached to every word we write out. It was this recognition of that concept in part which helped me formulate the ideas of liberty defined. I stopped trying to give analogies the way others did, and I wanted clarity of context. And in time, it would aid me in understanding what I missed, so I could eventually write morality defined, the follow-up to liberty defined. I had not, I mean, had I not been or scared by the prospect of being drafted and taken away from what little I knew without seemingly a choice because I was nescient, I wouldn't have come as far as I have in my own self-development, in my own self-reflection and self-discovery. I began understanding what government claiming jurisdiction over me was doing by listening to the stories set in fictional realms. I began to make the connections with entertainment I enjoyed and the research I was doing. Everyone from George Lucas's Star Wars and J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings to Kevin Costner's The Postman and Stephen King's Rita Hayworth in The Shawshank Redemption and Alexandre Dumas's The Count of Monte Cristo aided me in understanding the problems and solutions. Interestingly enough, as of now, the creation of this piece that you're listening to, I haven't read Mises or Rothbard or so many others yet. I figured out something without their help that is universally applicable and promotes creation by ensuring the means are in line with achieving the goals. I created a peaceful path out of a dark, shame-filled, cowering start. It's certainly not as horrendous as some of the fictional characters' journeys were, but it's also worse than others, having been thrown in a fireplace and terrorized by a man who never stopped to truly understand what he did to me was not discipline, but abuse, because I didn't understand what he was trying to convey, while he was just simply unable to explain simply enough to me as a child what the issue was. It is my tale of how I played the role of Edmond Dantes, or V if you like. It is how I came to understand the world around me. To some, it's going to be a sad, pathetic tale. To others, I hope it is inspiring. Regardless of what happens, it is my story, and I have chosen not to compete with anyone else except my former selves. We all have stories. What is important is that we learn to understand them so we can tell them to ourselves and listen to them in order to grow. We don't always need to ensure the world knows about us all the time. What we need to ensure is that we know about ourselves all the time. And that is how I came to realize the full importance of clarity in context and communication. But for now, I'd like to thank you for your time. If you found this helpful, please like, share, and give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to encourage more content like this, please visit my website, jimlimberdavis.com, to explore more of my works, download free copies of my ebooks, Liberty Defined and Morality Defined, and consider donating even just $1. If you have ideas for future topics that you'd like me to discuss, please leave your suggestions in the comment section below. And thank you so much for taking a peacefully proactive solution and bettering humanity's plight through comprehension and creation, instead of ridicule and destruction.